Grace and peace, beloved of St. Luke and friends. This week starts our busy fall. Tomorrow school starts and I will be there minus my vacation beard. But I will be in New York this coming weekend as we remember the 20th anniversary of September the 11th. I will be at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church on Central Park West, and they will be doing a Bach cantata as a part of the liturgy at which I will preach. Gottes Zeit is allerbester Zeit. God's time is always best. It's a funeral cantata meant to comfort with the good news of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's in that spirit that I go. I want to share with you today my reflections on the 20th anniversary of September the 11th. On Friday, you will also get a link to the video that I shared last year, made with our friends from Good Shepherd in Naperville, with an original cello string quartet as we look at images of September 11th. So that'll be coming on Friday. Here are my reflections now. September 11th has been commodified, interpreted, and cited to support going to war, fearing and blaming immigrants, jingoistic America First rhetoric. It has been buried in the history which followed it. We bombed Kabul 20 years ago in the name of 911, and today we cringe and grieve as we remember just recently suicide bombs going off in Kabul. But for me, the true feelings of that day are as vivid and searing as ever. We'd watched in horror from our 16th floor windows, office windows, as both towers lit up, then fell into a cloud of smoke and ash. We were then in the chapel of the Interchurch Center in Morningside Heights, and I'm facing hundreds of people who've gathered to pray. For the previous hour, we had all been doing what millions did throughout the metropolis, trying to track down people we loved and knew in Lower Manhattan. Now the chapel is filled with people not knowing their fate. As our prayer, I ask the people to name the names of those on their hearts and concern. Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, had said, "History happens when the sensitive crown of the human heart inclines to one side of the horizon or the other." 20 years later, that inclination of the human heart describes our mission context today. I heard the American heart incline and new history unfold as the chapel rang out with the precious names of loved ones, spoken through clenched teeth, strained and breaking voices. I hurled my own names to God. Where are they? Are they safe? In the names, I heard the sensitive crown of the human heart incline from security to insecurity, from entitlement to vulnerability, from the veneer of secularity to a yearning to speak to our Maker, from insularity to fleeting solidarity. What had always been just beyond the horizon, bubbling beneath the surface, began to come into view. Everything's changed. Nothing's changed. Everything's connected. Nothing's connected. Where's Rachel? Where's Janet? Where's God? Where's my neighbor? Where's the safe place now? What the hell happened? That fear has driven wars, a turning from the stranger among us, terror from Madrid to London to Oslo to Paris to Nice, economic pressure, graceless and balkanized public discourse and politics, a movement from solidarity towards the defended space, a fear of the emerging multicultural global interfaith post-faith world. These etch the contours of our Mars Hill mission context today. 20 years later, we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, a trend toward blood and soil nationalism in our own country and around the world. 20 years ago, an enemy attacked us. Today, more and more, the enemy is us as we struggle for our very democracy. 20 years ago, we lamented in solidarity singing God Bless America in Union Square, showing one another pictures of loved ones, like this one remembered by George Packer in the Atlantic. Giovanna Jenny Gamboa, 27 years old, 5'6", brown hair, brown eyes, last seen on the 102nd floor of World Trade Center. Call for any information. The sign was posted right after the attacks and stayed up long after, moving from an urgent request to a tribute to a lost daughter. It was that immediate, that visceral in New York, every hour, every day. Today in this pandemic, people die alone in hospitals and nursing homes, and our communal singing is strained or non-existent. Martin Marty shared this with us at a gathering at Concordia in Bronxville in the months after the 9/11 attacks. He quoted David Tracy, the theologian. "Before faith, hope, love, you must know finitude, all those falling bodies, contingency, I survived in my firehouse, 11 brothers didn't, and transience, the empty sky downtown." The Bible becomes very relevant because it talks to us about the horizon facing all of us, death. Our spiritual DNA, Augustine, the soul was made for God and will never rest until it rests in God, moved people around the world to gather, to pray in as broadly a context as possible, to go deep in our wrestling with God. On September 13th, religious leaders gathered at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Imams, rabbis, bishops, pastors, lay members, neighbors, gentle agnostics. As I gave a brief reflection, it occurred to me that Dietrich Bonhoeffer preached in this church for his good friend, Adam Clayton Powell. 20 years later, I think about what Bonhoeffer meant when he said that in a world come of age, we'll have to invent a new language for the faith. Today, it is possible to experience the whole world coming at us through our devices, social media. Someone draws a cartoon in Copenhagen and someone gets killed in Karachi. Yet we are more alone and more afraid and disconnected than we've ever been. Our mission field today is those who are asking the question, what is a well-lived life? To what can I become connected? What gifts do I want for my children and their children? Our mission is an apostolate to a world desperately seeking a vocation, a community shaped by a narrative, a promise of hope in this helter-skelter world. One of our chaplains anointed with oil, firemen rushing into one of the towers, a cruciform reminder of our baptism. There was a sense that we were baptized for this moment, that our lives mattered. Those descending the towers noted the glistening foreheads rushing past them to rescue, a Jacob's ladder with angels ascending and descending. Vocations came into view. Our hearts were broken, but they were broken open. We saw it 20 years later during the pandemic, how much we depended on each other and those essential workers. 20 years ago, there was one united Lutheran family in New York, ELCA and LCMS. And we worked through a pan-Lutheran organization, Lutheran Disaster Response New York. And David Benke, the president of the Atlantic District, and I, the bishop of the Metropolitan New York Synod, took turns being president of Lutheran Disaster Response New York. We formed LDR-NY late at night at Holy Trinity after we had been at 2 prayer services where the tri-state Lutherans gathered with neighboring bishops, after we'd been to ground zero with our presiding bishop and the president of the Missouri Synod. When we put it together, Lutheran Disaster Response New York was already a bridge to communities. We had quickly alliances with FEMA, Red Cross, and other ecumenical public and private networks. Veterans of Columbine helped Lutheran Disaster Response offer summer camps for New York kids in a time of post-traumatic stress. $200,000 from LDRNY seeded an unmet needs table, which leveraged millions of dollars of partnership support. On the weekend after Easter 2002, bishops and pastors from every synod of the ELCA gathered to pray together at Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church on Saturday night. And then they fanned out and preached in most of the 225 congregations of the Metropolitan New York Synod the following Sunday. $15 million of help from Lutherans in the U.S. and around the world flowed into the disaster response in New York. Now, 20 years later, the Lutheran community is deeply divided, and our only space for mission together is Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and Lutheran Services in America. Let us guard those sacred spaces. Just before the noon prayer service, with the smoke and ash on the horizon in front of me, I sent an email to friends, family, the Conference of Bishops, and leaders of our synod describing what happened, what I knew, and offering scripture and prayer. In the days ahead, these dispatches from the front were copied and sent to thousands across the world. I did not know that I'd started a blog, but I experienced the power of social media for communal prayer and lament. I began to be a bearer of the stories of many others and a messenger in New York for the love and solidarity of people around the world. 20 years later, this technology has kept us connected in worship and mutual consolation of the saints during the pandemic. My wife, Janet, directed a program called Project Life, a case management ministry for economic victims of September 11th. Like in every disaster, those left behind and bereft were people in poverty, already vulnerable. My wife, Janet, directed a program called Project Life with Lutheran Social Services of New York. It was a case management ministry for economic victims of September 11th. Like in every disaster, those left behind and bereft were people in poverty, already vulnerable. In New York, many were immigrants. Her case managers were young, just out of college. They included a Jewish hip-hop musician, an Arab Muslim arts major, an aspiring comedian doing stand-up on the weekends. I watched the burgeoning of what today we would call an emergent community. These were the millennials of that day. The terms of engagement were a community which enabled them to make a difference in the lives of others, where their own narratives were shared and taken seriously, where their work and struggle found opportunity for ritual and reflection, where the Abrahamic meta-narrative infused the community. 20 years later, the emerging generation is leading a public reckoning in gun violence in schools, racial justice, gender justice, immigration reform. It strikes me 20 years later, how many people on our globe live with post-traumatic stress? I still cannot speak at ground zero. Syria, Haiti, Tigray in Ethiopia, South Sudan, Honduras, El Salvador, all over the globe. Grief must be spoken again and again. Stories must be told for healing to be possible. I learned that again in the firehouses in New York after September 11th, and in narthexes and hallways and street corners as people spoke their truth. 20 years ago, you did a memorial for a firefighter, and then they found a jaw. The horror continued to emerge, giving weight to the book of Joel. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. The book of Lamentations begin, how lonely sits the city. Pastors encouraged and heard the stories. I visited every conference and did a one-on-one with every pastor with only one question: how's your soul? After many one-on-ones, memorials, funerals of firefighters, I saw how powerfully The firefighter community ritualizes its losses. And in memorials for the flight crews and for those in the banking community killed in the towers, there was revealed how much they were holding in their stories, like sheep without a shepherd. We cannot move from objects to subjects until we can own our own grief and tell our stories again and again. There is wisdom in Elisha's question to the widow. What can I do for you? What do you have in the house? For me, this will always be a day of lamentations. Kathleen O'Connor put beautifully the deep meaning of lamenting our losses. Lamentations is an act of resistance. It teaches us to lament and to become agents in our relationship with God, even if our fidelity only takes the form of telling God and one another our truth. Lamentations crushes false images, smashes syrupy pictures, destroys narrow theologies. It pours cold water upon theologies of a God who prospers us in all things, on a God who cares only about us, on a God who blesses our nation and punishes our enemies, as if we were God's only people. Our lamentations, still 20 years later, are not the isolation and depression of wounded entitlement or private grief, but the community at the foot of the cross, moving outward in solidarity and love toward the sorrow of the world God loves. Finally, this: I am more convinced than ever that a church in mission which turns its face, the collective face of Jesus, towards the poor, the stranger among us, and those hungry for a story and a vocation, will always be a church in renewal. Looking back 20 years and looking forward, this is what I see as I look towards the dawn. In the words of Peter de Vries in the book The Blood of the Lamb, this is what I see: the recognition of how long, how very long, is the mourner's bench upon which we sit, arms linked in undiluted friendship, all of us, brief links ourselves, in the eternal pity, and God holding it all up.